So fortunately, what that means is I won't be getting any urgent messages from my coworkers during the talk, as they'll all be asleep. This presentation is called The Elements of User Experience. It's based on a book that I wrote. I wrote the book back in 2002, which seems like a very long time ago on the web, but the book is actually selling better now than it ever has. What I tried to do when I wrote the book was I tried to capture the aspects of designing for the web that I thought would not change, or would not change very much as technology evolved. So this is, first of all, this is a 2-hour talk about design. This is not a talk about technology. This is also a talk about the web. A lot of the principles here, I think, do apply to designing other kinds of software products, but my examples are all going to come from the web, talking about websites and web-based applications. So if you're comfortable with all of that, welcome aboard. So I want to start out talking about something other than the web, though. I want to talk about a different kind of an experience. I'm going to ask each of you to try to fix in your mind a distinct memory of your own experience. And the experience that I'd like for you to try to think about and try to recall as vividly as you can is the experience of the worst movie you've ever seen. Of course, Indian cinema is well known around the world. The Indian people clearly are very passionate about movies. I thought some of the statistics, and if you guys saw the keynote from the gentleman from Nokia earlier, some of the statistics about cinema in the country were very interesting. So I hope that this is something that we can all share, not only that we've had good experiences at the movies, but we've had bad ones as well. These are just a few movies that in the United States are known for delivering bad experiences to their users. And so it's funny to think about because they've been doing this for a long time now. The cinema industry in the United States is nearly 100 years old, more or less, producing thousands of movies every year. They've had a lot of opportunities to figure out how to get this right. And yet every year, more bad movies. More disappointing experiences. It seems sometimes as if they have this entire industry that's solely devoted to creating things for people to make fun of. But that's not actually the case. Nobody sets out to make a bad movie. Everybody going into creating a movie is creating it with some good intentions. Intentions of creating a positive experience for their audience. So what goes wrong? How is it that these bad movies keep coming out? Well, one important part of it is that filmmaking is a very complex process. There's a lot that goes into creating a movie. You've got writing the script, finding the right actors, creating the sets, filming, recording sound. These days you have all those crazy special effects involved, the slow motion dance sequences. And each of those, all of those layers of complexity, they all provide ways to get it wrong. Places where we can make mistakes. Places where if the pieces don't come together in the right way, we end up delivering a bad experience to the audience. And so in that memory of yours of the worst movie you've ever seen, you probably came out of that experience walking out of the theater. Maybe you walked out at the end of the movie. Maybe you didn't wait until the end of the movie to walk out. You were probably pinning the blame on somebody on the other side. That director, that writer, that actor, that composer who wrote that score. The experience that people have with websites, though, is very different. When people have bad experiences with websites, they often say things like this: I probably overlooked the right choice. These are actual quotes from user interviews that we've done at Adaptive Path. I must not have read the instructions closely enough. Or my favorite, I guess I'm just not smart enough to use this website. So when people have a bad experience with our work, they don't blame us. We get a free ride because they're blaming themselves. Because our products don't just make people unhappy, they make people feel stupid. I mentioned this in the keynote earlier, and I think this is really the only point of connection between the keynote and this talk, for what it's worth, the idea that products are people too. And the way that we react emotionally to interacting with a product is so fundamental to our experience of it that we end up creating this relationship with the product that is like if you have a coworker who is rude to you, or if you go out on a date with somebody and all they want to do is talk about themselves and their own problems and their own needs, and they don't express any interest in you, the reaction that you're going to have, the emotional connection that you're going to have with that person is a negative connection. And in the same way, when we create products that treat people with poor manners, the emotional connection that people are going to have with our products is going to be a negative connection. What we need to do is deliver to them an experience that creates positive emotional connections. The way that we do this is through what we call user-centered design. Now, user-centered design, it sounds like one of these big software methodologies, right? Like agile development or the rational unified process or something like that, but it's not. It's not a formalized methodology. It's a philosophy. It's a way of thinking about product design. Looking at the product not as an end in itself, but as a means of delivering that experience that creates a positive connection for the user. Those positive connections are what drive use, what drives adoption, and what drives word of mouth, and what drives everything that keeps a website going. The way that we create that positive experience is through a set of methods for understanding people, understanding human behavior as people interact with technology, and being able to describe that behavior in a way that helps drive the choices that we make about the design of the product. So what we're talking about here is how the product behaves, how the product is used in the real world, not just looking at the product in the test lab, not just looking at the product from an engineering perspective, but looking at the product from the perspective of the human on the other end, the context of the product in people's lives. I want to give you an example. Let's see if we can kind of piece apart what are all the aspects of the user experience of this web page. This is a product page from Amazon.com. One of our conference sponsors. Thank you, Amazon. Now, if you ask somebody to comment on the design of this page, they might say something about the colors and the shapes of the buttons or the navigation bar. or the typography, the fonts that are used on the page. That's what we talk about when we talk about design, right? Fonts and colors. But this stuff is really just the surface of the design. In order to understand the experience that the product delivers, we have to look deeper than this. So let's look beyond those details. Let's kind of get rid of the color out of that page. Maybe blur those details so we can't quite make them out anymore. And if we start to look at it from this perspective, we can start to see something else going on here. We can start to see an organization, a structure to the page that communicates something about the nature of the page. In fact, we can take those details away altogether and we're still left with a representation of the design of the page. Something that I call the skeleton of the design. But on a website, no page exists in isolation, right? Because every page has other pages connected to it that have other pages connected to them. And these connections between pages, or between page states if you prefer in an AJAX application, define the structure of the experience that people will have as they move through the various interfaces of the application. But there's another level still to the experience of this site. Because if we look simply at those individual interfaces, at those components of the experience, and we forget about the connections between them, what we have is essentially a list of features and functionality, the components of the application and the tasks that the application supports. A checklist defining the scope of the experience. What are the aspects of the experience that the application will provide, and what aspects will the application not provide? But each of those items on that list really simply serves as a part of the answer to an even deeper question. The question in the minds of the developers of, what's the big idea here? What's this thing supposed to be? What's it supposed to do for people in the world? What's the strategy underlying the experience that we're delivering? So in the Elements model, I visualize all of these aspects of the experience as these 5 planes, starting out at the lowest level with the strategy, the basic idea behind the website. Layered on top of the strategy is the scope, the set of features and functionality that fulfill that idea, the characteristics of that. We map out the relationships between the various features and functionality in the structure. That structure is manifested on the page at the skeleton level. And then finally, we get back to the stuff that we always talk about when we talk about design, the surface level details. And so what we have is this sort of continuum of more abstract considerations as we move further down and more concrete considerations up higher toward the top. Now it can be confusing, especially for developers who may not have much experience working with designers, to hear designers talk about the design of websites, because there's a lot of different terminology that gets thrown around. And in some cases, it can seem like people are using 2 different terms to mean exactly the same thing. Or 2 people might use the same term in completely different ways. I think that part of the reason for this confusion about terminology that we use to describe the aspects of a design has to do with the way that people look at the web itself. Some people look at the web and they say, oh, I know what this is. It's got data, and that data is formatted and laid out on pages, and those pages are put together in a particular order, like a publication, like my daily newspaper. They look at the web as a medium for delivering information. Information, that's what the web's all about, right? Other people look at the same web and they see something very different. They see mechanisms for input and output. They see interfaces. They see something that kind of reminds them of a program on their desktop. They see the web as an application. The challenge, and I think in many ways the most interesting thing about the web, is that the web is both things, all the time. The web is both an information medium and an interface to applications. And so in order for us to be able to design effectively for the web, we have to take this basic duality in the nature of the web into consideration. So let's take our 5 planes. On one side, looking at the web as a software interface. On the other side, looking at the web as hypertext, as an information system. And we'll split it right down the middle. And now we can take that whole confusing tangle of terminology that people use to talk about the design of websites, and we can map those terms into our 5 planes. So this is the elements of user experience model. Now I'm going to go through and talk about each of these items individually, and we'll look at how all of the pieces fit together to create the overall experience. Starting out at the lowest level at the strategy plane. Now, this is the most abstract level. We're as far from design as you can possibly get. Because we're not really talking about design at all. We're talking about the big idea behind the website. Now, regardless of whether you're looking at the web as a software interface or the web as a hypertext system, there are 2 considerations that you have to balance here. The first consideration is for your users. What does this site have to do for the people who are going to use it? The other consideration, the consideration you probably hear a lot more about around the office, is what is this thing going to do for you? How's it going to help your organization reach your business objectives? What must the site do for the people who are building it? Now, when we talk about user needs, in general, there are a handful of needs that we can say apply to every website. All users who use every kind of website, they need products that fundamentally work. They need products that they can actually use, that they can understand. They need products that fulfill their expectations for what the product will do. But most of the time, when we talk about user needs, in order to say anything meaningful, we have to be specific. We have to talk about the needs of our users, our audience, as they relate to our product. And the way that we accomplish this is through user research. So if you want to know how people are going to use your product, watch them or ask them. User research is a powerful tool for uncovering aspects of user behavior that you would never imagine. This is one of the most favorite parts of my job for me, is doing user research, because if you're doing it properly, it will always surprise you. You will always discover things that you never imagined about how people are going to interact with your product. There are lots of different ways you can do user research. You can do it really quick and inexpensive on the fly. You can draw sketches of interfaces and put them in front of your friends and family and ask them how they would react to them. Or you could do a lengthy and expensive field research study, like the study that I talked about this morning, where we flew all over the country and spent months interviewing people and taking pictures of them in their homes and watching how they interacted with the product that we were redesigning. This book is called Observing the User Experiences by Mike Kuniowski, who co-founded Adaptive Path with me. And this is not just because Mike's a friend of mine. This is my favorite book about user research. It's not a short book. It's about that thick. And it's sort of this encyclopedia of user research techniques. And what I really like about this book is the way that basically If you can figure out what kinds of questions you need answers to, this book will tell you what kinds of research methods are appropriate for getting answers to those questions. Now, one of the things that we contend with a lot, especially as we're working on applications that are intended to reach a broad consumer market, is, well, how do we identify the user needs of everyone? My product is for everyone. Well, we have to get down to some kind of concrete detail here, and the way that we do that is through user segmentation. We look at the audience, we analyze their characteristics, find things that they have in common, and break them down into several smaller audiences. We sort them out by what they have in common so that we can have focused, meaningful conversations about the needs of specific segments of our audience. So we can look at demographic details. We can look at things like their access to technology. And based on those characteristics, we can make choices about the design of the product. Out of those user segments, we develop these sort of character sketches that we call personas. Basically, we do a whole bunch of analysis, we collect a whole bunch of data about real people, and then we use that data to help us create some fake people, some fictional characters that represent hypothetical users of our website. And these personas, these fictional characters, help guide us through the design process because we can have conversations about them and about their circumstances. We stop talking about the user, and we start talking about Janet, and we start talking about Frank. So by extrapolating from this general set of characteristics to a specific case, we can start to have a more meaningful conversation. So what we do is we generate this, all of this detail about this person, and we put it all together on a single sheet of paper, and we print that out. And in any physical environment in the office where we're making design decisions, we make sure that we have these personas up on the walls around us. There's been some interesting psychological research having to do with the way that people react to photographs of other people. They found that if they put up warning, please don't steal from us signs in retail shops, and if they include a picture of a person on the sign, the incidence of shoplifting goes down significantly because there's something about having somebody staring at you that really kind of drives the point home. And so for us as designers, if we have these faces of our users all kind of sitting around staring at us as we're making design decisions about them, it affects how we think about the problem. So you give them names, come up with a little quote that summarizes their attitude toward the product, give them various kind of technographic and psychographic details, what kind of technology they have access to, what kind of websites they like. I like to put these screenshots in here of the different websites so that we can refer to what are the interface and navigation conventions that they might be used to as we're making design choices. Now, all of that stuff is about the users, and all of that stuff is really important. But we have to balance the needs of the users with our own needs. And so we often talk in terms of business. We talk about the business goals, the business drivers, the business requirements. But we're not talking simply about identifying the mission statement for our website. But what we want to do is talk about what's the role that the website serves for the business? What's the objective for the site, independent of everything else that we're doing? Why do we even have this thing? I can't tell you how many projects we've worked on at Adaptive Path where we've had companies come to us and say, well, we started this website a few years ago because all of our competitors had one and we felt we needed to have one too, but we don't really know why we're doing this anymore. They've asked us to help them figure that out. One of the things that we ask them in response is, well, what are your success metrics? And often the answer is we don't have success metrics. But if you don't have the means of measuring whether or not you're successful, well, it's no wonder you don't know what your site is doing for you. So the goal of success metrics is to identify measurable aspects of user behavior that correspond to our business goals. So we can say not just that page views are going up and therefore that's good, but we can say that there are specific aspects of user behavior that we know drive sales, or that we know drive revenue in some fundamental way. And so in this example, additionally, going into a redesign process, this allows us to make choices about the design that we know are going to connect back to these metrics, so that when we see, following the launch of the redesigned site, how those metrics have changed, we know if we're doing better or worse, and we know what different choices we have to make. So what this is all about is taking those conversations where you go round and round the table, talking about your preferences versus my preferences versus somebody else's preferences about what makes a good website, and talking specifically about what needs to change and how does that connect with the needs of our users. Balancing user needs and site objectives. This is essential in formulating the strategy for the website. But now we have to take the strategy and move beyond that and start to turn that into features and functionality in the scope. And here's where the dynamic between the web as a software interface and the web as a hypertext system really starts to come into play. When we look at the web as software, we define the scope through our functional specifications. What are the application features that the site must include? When we look at the web as hypertext, we're thinking about it in terms of the content requirements. What are the content elements that the site has to incorporate? And again, by getting detailed and getting specific about these, we can make concrete choices and we can prioritize the work that we do. So in functional specifications, we identify what are the application features that people will use, that people will need in order to fulfill their goals. Again, we're not yet talking about technology. We're talking about functionality from the user's perspective. What are the tasks that the application enables? Being specific as specific as we can without dictating the design of the underlying system. A lot of organizations are really good at functional specifications. They can spend months and months and months working on the functional specifications. They might not spend any time at all developing their content requirements, and then discover that they haven't really thought about what information people are going to need from the site, what form that information is going to take. Who's going to be responsible for coming up with that information? So many times there are all of these ideas that people have about, wouldn't it be great if the site incorporated this kind of information or that kind of information, and it's all somebody else's responsibility to pull it all together. With content requirements as well as with functional specifications, we're always defining these elements according to their purpose, according to the underlying user needs, the underlying site objectives that they correspond to. Now, in a lot of organizations, documentation is not very popular. People say documentation is a waste of time. Nobody ever reads the docs. Nobody ever reads them because they're never up to date. They're never up to date because they're too much trouble to maintain. But if your documentation isn't working for you, it's probably because you're doing it wrong. Planning is what enables you to avoid the kinds of conflicts late in the development process that lead to budget and schedule overruns. The key is to integrate documentation into the process rather than making it a separate step. So instead of making all your decisions and then going off to write them all down, make writing them down a part of the decision-making process. Balancing the functional specifications with the content requirements, we now have a definition of the features and the functionality that constitute the scope of the application. Now we have to map out the interrelationships between those features and functions with the structure. On the software interface side, we're looking at questions of interaction design, mapping out how the user is going to move from one step in a process to the next. Looking at the web as hypertext, we're dealing with issues of information architecture. How does the user move from one content element to the next? We're defining the user's movement through the system, the movement through the experience. Interaction design is a relatively new concept in software development. It's been around for about 10 years now. But it's pretty straightforward. It's about documenting the actions that take place between the user and the system. The behavior of the user, and the way that the system responds to that, the behavior of the system, and the ways that that's intended to provoke a response from the user. Information architecture is a little bit more complex because here we're not talking about behavioral patterns, but we're talking about patterns in data. Now, not patterns in data in the way that you might be thinking, not patterns, structural or semantic patterns in data, but patterns that have to do with the way that people think about information, the conceptual relationships between content elements. We often take a hierarchical approach to information architecture, putting information into categories and subcategories. But there are lots of different ways that you can approach information architecture. When we look at the hierarchies in information architecture, we're often looking at these two different approaches. One we call top-down and the other is bottom-up. In the top-down approach, we start out by thinking about what are all of the categories of all the different kinds of information that we might want. Start out by defining all those categories, then taking our content, coming from our content requirements, and slot that content up into those various categories. Bottom-up information architecture, as you might imagine, comes at it from the other perspective. We start out with the content. We perform a low-level analysis of the content to identify the basic patterns, to define a low-level set of categories, and then we extrapolate higher-level categories from there. There's no right or wrong approach there. And frequently, it's very difficult to do bottom-up information architecture if you don't already have existing content that you're working from. But if you're trying to create a new information architecture from scratch, often a top-down approach is going to be a better approach for you. So in the case of both information architecture and interaction design, you're looking at something that's pretty abstract. And often the way that we have to communicate that abstraction is really crucial to the success of our work. So we document this through these various visual representations, these diagrams. Here we have a couple of examples of from a system of documentation that I developed called the Visual Vocabulary. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And so here we are at the structure level, where we're mapping out these interrelationships, defining the interaction design, defining the information architecture. Now we're going to take those interrelationships and start to map that into a structure on the page at the skeleton level. And here we have three major considerations. Regardless of whether we're dealing with web as application or web as information, we have to deal with issues of information design. How does the site facilitate the user's comprehension of the information that we have to present? Looking at the web as software, we're dealing with issues of interface design. How do we facilitate the user's input to the system and the output that they get back? And looking at the web as hypertext, we're dealing with issues of navigation design. How do we facilitate the user's movement through the website? Information design constitutes some of the most interesting and challenging problems in designing for the web because it's about a really fundamental question. How can we present this information so that people can understand it and use it? And some of the issues that come into play here are questions like how do we communicate the relative importance of different pieces of information? How do we guide the user's attention from one piece of information to the next? How do we draw their attention to important details? Communicate the relationships between different elements. Here's an example of information design at work. This is a map of San Francisco. This is the city where I live. And if you were to come visit the city of San Francisco and you went to the San Francisco Tourist Bureau and asked them for a map, this is the map you would get from them. And in this map, the emphasis here is on the kinds of things that visitors to San Francisco are most interested in, such as where can I find the cable cars? And where's Chinatown? And where are all the major tourist landmarks in San Francisco? Now, for those of us who live in San Francisco, we don't really use this map too much. It's not really valuable to us. The map that most people I know who live in San Francisco use is this one. It's a map of the very same area. This is the map that's put out by the San Francisco Municipal Transit Authority. They're the ones who run the buses and the trains in San Francisco. And all of that detail that we saw on the tourist map is present on this map too. But the emphasis here is very different. The emphasis here is on how do you get around in the city of San Francisco. But I think the most interesting map of San Francisco that I've seen is this one. This map, again, has a lot of the same detail on it as those other ones. The cable cars are still there. This map is put out by an organization in San Francisco called San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. And San Francisco is a city that is notorious for its very steep hills. And so the key information on this map are in these red bars that you see on the map. And each of the different shades of red indicates how steep the incline is on that block. Very important information if you're trying to get around San Francisco on a bicycle. So 3 different maps, 3 different audiences with different user needs, 3 different approaches to the information design of the map. Now, interface design is something that I think everybody has lots of opinions about. Providing a means for users to interact with application functionality. And I think that we often don't recognize how complex interface design really can be. For example, this is an interface to Google. It's far more complicated than the interface that I usually use. But whoever designed this interface had choices that they had to make about how they expose the functionality of Google to the users in a way that they can interact with, a way that they can interpret. All of these are questions of interface design. Then we've got navigation design. Now, you can have the world's best information architecture, but if your navigation doesn't successfully communicate all of the choices that are available to the user and facilitate their movement through that architecture, the architecture is not going to be successful. And again, we have a lot of different design choices available to us to help us communicate those relationships. Communicate how the different pieces of the website all fit together. In the design process, all of these issues of information design, issues of interface design, issues of navigation design, they all come together in this document that we call the wireframe. The wireframe is not as detailed as a full interface mockup. It's really just kind of a high-level sketch. But what we're doing when we're creating the wireframes is we're working through all of these issues and how all the pieces have to fit together, defining the relative priority of the various elements of the page. We want to start thinking about page layout approaches, but we're not really ready to do that yet because what we're wrestling with here is something more fundamental, which is the interplay between information and interface. To make functionality more accessible, we can use visual design to make information more understandable. This is an older screenshot of a site called Orbitz, which is a site that lets you book airplane tickets. And on the Orbitz website, across the entire site, they used this color palette, these 10 colors, is all they use throughout the entire site. But they use these colors in very precisely controlled ways to communicate different aspects of the design. So we have these 3 shades of blue, for example. These are the 3 shades of blue in the Orbitz logo. These are their identity colors. So for the areas of the design that resonate most strongly with this notion of identity, these are the colors that they use. So where we see the title of the page and the primary navigation, we see that represented in these colors. Wherever we have application functionality on the website, that functionality is always made distinct through the use of these sort of yellow-beige colors up here in the upper right. So whenever there's something for the user to interact with, that's always made clear through the set of colors that they've chosen to use. And they always use those colors and only those colors. They don't have any colors that are close to those colors on the website. They really push the functionality and the information kind of far apart through the choice of the colors that they employ on the website. And then they have a couple of these highlight colors, the green and the orange down here in the lower left. And these, I think, they use in some really interesting, really precisely controlled ways. Wherever they have support information, that information is highlighted using this shade of green. And again, there isn't another shade of green that appears on the website. So you help the user develop these habits when they always are able to recognize the same color consistently, and it's always used in certain contexts. That reinforces what that functionality does, what that feature is, so that when they see something brand new, but it's colored green, they know what it's supposed to do for them. Even if they can't even describe it really, they still have that knowledge kind of back there in the back of their head. Anything on the website that carries, on this website that carries the user forward in the process is highlighted in orange, like that search button down at the bottom. So orange means forward on Orbitz.com. Again, the user might not ever be able to tell you that that's the case, but through use of the site, the colors reinforce this to help support the choices that we made about the interface design, to help support the choices that we made about the interaction design. Typography is another area where we can use type in very controlled ways to reinforce different aspects of what we're trying to communicate with the type. This is a screenshot from a couple of years ago from Apple's website. And here they've only got a handful of typefaces on this page, but they use these typefaces consistently throughout the site to reinforce the choices that they've made about the information and about what they want to present to the users. Especially interesting, I think, is this use of Geneva. Geneva is a typeface that Apple designed to be highly readable at very small point sizes. And so anytime they've got a lot of information to communicate in a very small space, like we see in the sidebar on the right-hand side, Geneva is what they use. So at the surface, we're taking everything that's kind of come up to this point and giving it a visual presentation that reinforces all of the choices that we've made. So this is the overall elements of user experience model. Now let's look at how this model would be applied in the development of a website. And let's not look at a whole website, let's just look at one feature of a website. Let's look at a search engine on a website. This is a piece of application functionality that I think a lot of websites have in common. Almost every site seems to have some kind of a search engine on it. And yet for all of these search engines out there, there doesn't seem to be any standard way to do it. They've all got these different approaches to it. Now the reasons for these different approaches, I think, really have to do with the underlying choices that they've made with all of these different elements of the user experience, starting out with the strategy. Identifying the user needs that go along with the search engine. Like, do users even want a search engine? I'm always surprised at websites that have made the choice not to include a search engine on them, but there are some circumstances where you really don't want people to be able to search that website. If people do want a search engine on the website, are there limits to the kind of search functionality that those users need? Do they want to be able to search everything? Are there only certain types of information that they need to be able to search? Those user needs are then balanced against the site objectives. And here we're often talking about questions of resource planning. Is implementing search feasible given our resources? Is this our highest priority right now? Are there other things that those resources could be devoted to? Based on that strategy, we define a scope for the search engine through the functional specifications. Most search engines allow users to type in keywords, but there might be other fields for specifying search criteria. Some search engines allow people to narrow the result set as they refine a search. Although a search engine is generally thought of as a technology implementation kind of a project, there's a lot of content that goes into creating a search engine. The labeling of search functionality is really critical in users being able to use it. The structuring of result data on search results pages. The documentation that goes along with the search engine. Then we turn that into a structure for the search process. Through the interaction design, the choices available to users at each step through the search process. The way that the system behaves under various conditions. Then we have the information architecture. Do we include the architectural scope of the site itself? Do we integrate that into how the search functionality works? How do we integrate information architecture considerations into the metadata structures that drive the search engine? At the skeleton level, we've got information design. How do we lay out the search results so that people can comprehend them? How do we communicate error conditions? How do we let people know that they formulated a bad query? How do we facilitate that user input through the interface design of the search engine, like that Google example we were looking at earlier? Then we've got navigation design issues. How do we move people into and out of the search flow? How do we allow them to navigate through the search results? And then we have these surface considerations. And again, this is something that we might not really think has a big impact for the design of a search engine, but it can be really dramatic. So here are search results off of Apple's website. Here's some search results from a different website. And the interesting thing about these two search results pages is that the functionality underlying them is almost exactly the same. The information being presented is almost exactly the same. Page titles, page summaries, refinement functionality. But the impression that this one leaves you with is very, very different, because this is a search results page from IBM's website, and their brand is very different from the Apple brand. So by reinforcing branding through the visual design of the search results, we're able to connect better with the users. This is another example. This is kind of small and hard to see, but a visual design really driving search functionality. This is from the Volkswagen website. And here they have gone with this extreme sort of minimalist approach to the visual design. As a result, a lot of the search functionality that we saw on those earlier web pages doesn't even exist here. But fortunately, they've got the underlying technology to make it good enough that if you type in Beetle as a search query, you actually get the Beetle page as your #1 hit. So the technology is still important here in supporting these choices that we make about visual design. So all of this stuff is about making sure that we're asking the right questions. At every point in the design process, understanding what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? What are the consequences of our proposed solution to the problem? Can we make a change to the navigation design in a way that will not impact the visual design? Can we adjust the information architecture in such a way that won't require us to generate new content requirements? Will this solution force us to rethink other problems that we thought we'd already solved? By understanding all of the considerations and the relationships between them, we can make smarter choices in the design process. Now, some of this stuff is stuff that in a lot of organizations, they don't really understand the value of it. They don't really understand the need to be methodical about design, the need to be systematic about design. And they have lots of reasons why we shouldn't be doing things this way. So for example, when you talk about doing user research, you talk about analyzing user behavior, a lot of organizations say, well, we've got market research, we've got demographics, isn't that all we need? But there's a real difference between knowing how old your users are and knowing how they interact with a piece of functionality. User behavior data is not the same thing as demographic data. Or they'll say things like, well, we don't need to do all this work to define all the different aspects of the user experience. We'll follow this list of guidelines. Look, top 10 tips for a more usable website. Just follow this. These rules of thumb, they have to be general because there are so many different kinds of websites that in order to be able to say anything about every kind of website, you have to say something that's practically meaningless. Or organizations refuse to devote resources to user interface development because user interfaces aren't seen as being very difficult to do. But in fact, the human part of the equation here is invariably the most complex. People are a lot harder to figure out than databases. In a lot of cases, organizations see this as being the domain of highly experienced experts who are obviously very, very expensive. But that doesn't have to be the case. A lot of these techniques are cheap, they're quick, they're easy. Anybody can do them. User interface planning is something that a lot of organizations object to. The idea of figuring out exactly, specifying the experience before you start building. But again, these products that we work on are incredibly complex. I mean, can you imagine an airplane company deciding to improvise a jetliner? That's the level of complexity that we're talking about here. Well, whatever problems there are with the user interface, we'll fix them in quality assurance. We'll do testing at the end, and we'll have our testers file usability bugs. But as we've seen, it's all connected, from the surface all the way on down to the strategy. And if you haven't thought things through at those lower levels, that can manifest in ways that are impossible to fix at the end of the process. And of course, there are always the schedule considerations, right? But the time that you spend getting things right now is time that you won't be spending fixing things that all of your users are complaining about, instead of developing the cool new stuff for the next iteration of your website. It's really critical in the design process for design to happen in a rational way, where we can have a conversation about users and about user needs that is based on a shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. If you hear people say things like this, you probably don't have that shared understanding, such as design by default. We should just do whatever is easiest to implement. This is how you see so many applications come to market where the interface that was shipped to user was the same interface that the lead developer used to test the underlying functionality. Or design by mimicry, where you just look at whatever the popular trends are with interfaces out there. You know, sliders. Everybody's got sliders on their website. We got to have sliders too. or simply designed by fiat, where the person in the room who has the most powerful, important title on the card gets to be the person who makes the decision. Again, these are signs that you're not having that conversation that you need to be having based on a shared understanding of user needs and user behavior. So I'm a consultant. I've worked as a consultant for a long time. And this is a metaphor that I use a lot when I'm talking with my clients about design and the web. The difference between running a marathon and running a sprint. Now, a sprint is a very short race. And your strategy for running a sprint is optimized for a short race. You have to get a quick start right off the line. You want to burn as much energy as you can, as quickly as you can. Now, a marathon is a very different kind of a race. You have to pace yourself. You have to make choices strategically about when you're burning your energy. So then the questions that you have to ask yourselves as you're thinking about your approach to development are, which race are you trying to run? What strategy are you employing? Are you employing a marathon strategy? Or are you employing a sprint strategy? And then which race are you actually in? Because some projects are sprint projects, and some projects are marathons. Now, if you try to run a sprint like a marathon, you're never going to win. If you try to run a marathon like a sprint, you're never going to finish. Understanding what type of project you're facing and developing a strategy optimized for that is critical to be successful. Some people look at this elements model and they map it to a waterfall process. They say, okay, well, this is how we need to approach the design of our site. We'll develop a strategy. When the strategy is finished, we'll develop the scope. And when that's finished, we'll develop the structure. When that's finished, we'll develop the skeleton. And when that's finished, we'll develop the surface. The trouble with this is that it doesn't take into consideration the interplay among all these elements. The reason that I had to articulate all this stuff in the first place when I was working in a consultancy where all of the work had typically been done, this was years ago, by a single designer who did all of this stuff. And in that situation, it's hard to pull apart what's going on inside that person's head. But when it evolved into a team dynamic, it became something very different. And we had to take a different approach. But when you try to take this waterfall approach, then you run into trouble because you can't backtrack. Because that thing is already finished, and whoever was working on that has moved on to something else. And anyway, the schedule won't allow for a change in the structure to modify the scope, or a change at the skeleton level to modify the strategy. The key is not to have each work in each plane finish before the next one starts, but rather have that work finish before the next one finishes. As long as each one finishes before the next, you'll be okay. You have to build a little bit of overlap into your processes so that you have opportunities to understand the interplay between these different components. Now, all of this is made possible through taking an iterative approach to development. A website, those of us who work on the web are so fortunate because, compared to other people who produce other kinds of products, because our work is alive. We can constantly be fiddling with it and tweaking it and refining it, making it better. We're not creating software that has to be shipped off to manufacturing to be stamped on CDs and put in boxes and put on store shelves, and we can never touch it again. So the key in creating and instituting an iterative development process in our organizations is to acknowledge that the site doesn't really ever stop evolving. The goal is to do what we can in the near term and always be looking ahead to the next release so that we can take the things that may be lower priorities right now, things that we can't do in the near term, and use those as the seed for the next release of the product. To keep this in mind, that the product is always evolving, and that instead of our functional requirements, our content requirements being this thing that this big, huge thing that we create, and it's this solid mass that is unchanging. Make it a living document. Make it something that evolves as you evolve. Now, some people look at the elements model and they see roles. They see, okay, well, for each box on the diagram, I've got to have one person who does that thing. So I'll hire an information architect and an interaction designer and an information designer and a visual designer. But that's not really what this is about. This isn't about roles. It's about considerations. Making sure that all of those considerations are reflected in the roles and in the processes that we have in place. So we can have a team where we have some people who are specialists who just do one aspect of it. Or we can have a very small team where there's a lot of collaboration and people are juggling multiple responsibilities. Or we can have something in between. The specific roles don't really matter. What matters is making sure that all of these considerations are accounted for so that we have a user experience that's founded on that understanding of user behavior. So I want to take a step back from all of that stuff and talk a little bit about the visual vocabulary. This is a system that I developed a few years ago. In my work as an information architect, I became really interested in the problem of communicating these abstract concepts. My job was to come up with these and define these conceptual relationships among user tasks, conceptual relationships among the different content elements of a website. And I had to get that across to developers and get that across to my fellow designers that I was working with in a way that was understandable to them. So I spent all of my time really kind of poring over these diagrams, these boxes and arrows. People talk about sitemaps, talk about user flows. The goal of these architecture diagrams is to provide the big picture of the user experience. This is the one place in the entire design process where we can see all at once everything that the user can do with the website. Usually we're so focused on individual pieces of functionality and the considerations in each of them that we don't often get to see that big picture. When we are focused on those detail level decisions, having something like this provides context for those decisions. It allows us to see how what we're working on fits into the larger scheme of the overall product, the experience that we're delivering. Once that diagram is created, it serves as the foundation for the rest of the project. You keep referring back to it because it helps you make better choices along the way. And for me, working as a consultant, this is often what I've referred to as the trophy deliverable. Because of all of the things that we would produce over the course of a project for our clients, this is the one thing that the client would want to print out really big and put up on the wall somewhere in their office for everybody to see. Because this is the thing that says, look, this is what we're doing. This is what we've built. So there are a lot of different audiences that have to use these diagrams that I would create. I'd have to communicate with the developers. I would have to communicate with designers. I would have to communicate with business stakeholders. It was vital that everybody understood what it was that we were building. And so this out of this, I developed this, this philosophy about these deliverables. The idea of maximizing their portability, making sure that the widest possible audience could distribute it and open and print and read and use them. Because if I couldn't make sure that all of those different audiences were able to make use of what I was creating, I was putting the project in jeopardy. I was putting the success of the work itself in jeopardy. So out of this, I developed kind of these standard practices. I hate paper. I hate using paper for deliverables because I will reliably lose paper. If somebody gives me requirements on paper, it's pretty much guaranteed that that thing is going to disappear off my desk. I'm never going to see it again. If I have it electronically, it's searchable, it's findable. It also can be stored in repositories that are readily accessible by development teams that are spread out around the world. Unless a document needs to be edited by others, I prefer to deliver it in PDF because you never know who might need access to it in the future. And a lot of these organizations, they don't have access to the kind of tools that we have access to. Designing for standard page sizes is part of that. I remember early on, I was working with a client who was incredibly frustrated because the work that they had had from the designers that they'd been working with, they had to, the designers were delivering to them these gigantic sheets, having the entire architecture all mapped out. But in order for the client to be able to use them, they had to print them out as these stacks of these tiles that then they would have to tape together, tape all these little pieces of paper together to be able to see the whole thing. And then the designer would make one little change, and then they'd have to print a whole new set out and tape them all together so that they could see what had changed. The other thing also is the use of color as a redundant information channel. So if something has to be, if some vital piece of information has to be communicated, don't just use color to do that. Use color plus something else to reinforce that, that piece of information that you're trying to communicate so that if somebody takes your deliverable and photocopies it for distribution, or they don't have access to a color printer, that your documentation is still usable, that the documentation doesn't become worthless simply because the inkjet ran out of ink. So I started to develop these practices, and out of these practices, I started to develop a system for how I documented my work as an information architect. And this system I published on the web a few years ago, and I called it the visual vocabulary. And I called it a vocabulary because it's kind of like a language. It's a way of expressing ideas visually. A set of standard shapes to express common concepts, concepts that you see over and over again in the experience that people have with a website. The vocabulary itself, because it had to be used both by me and by other people that I worked with as well as our clients, it was designed to be what I call tool agnostic, meaning that it didn't rely on the features of any particular piece of software in order to create these diagrams. Microsoft Visio is probably the most popular diagramming tool among information architects. And Visio is great. It's a really super powerful tool. And I know some people who are able to do amazing things in Visio. But for all those people who don't have Visio, I didn't want my system to rely on their access to it in order for them to be able to use it effectively. I also wanted the visual vocabulary to be what I call whiteboard compatible. And what I mean by that is that I almost never start at the computer when I'm doing this kind of work. When I'm sketching out interaction flows, I'm almost always starting at a whiteboard. I can think more quickly somehow. I don't know, I think there's something about simply standing up, and I think that there's something about the kind of the sketchiness, the messiness of the whiteboard that encourages experimentation. It encourages playing around with ideas, and it encourages freely making mistakes with your ideas. So when I'm standing at the whiteboard and I'm sketching, I'm not really very precise. I work in the design industry, but I wasn't trained as a designer. I can't really draw a very good straight line. These things, they always come out kind of messy, and so I felt like what I needed was for all of the different elements of the vocabulary to have really distinct shapes that you could easily tell one from the other, at least the way that I draw them, so that it didn't leave room for interpretation, and it didn't require a great deal of precision for me to really kind of get that drawing exactly right for you to be able to understand what I was trying to get across. And I wanted it to be self-contained. I wanted it to not rely on being part of a larger tool set. When I talk to people about the visual vocabulary, something that often comes up is UML. Anybody here work with UML in your work? A few? You guys like UML? It's not very popular among the people who use it. UML, Unified Modeling Language, is intended to address some of the same considerations that the visual vocabulary addresses. And I talk to people about it, and they're like, well, why don't you just do it like UML? And I'm like, I deal with a lot of people, especially business people, marketing people, who have no background in UML whatsoever. And I'm not about to try to teach them UML in order for them to be able to understand what I'm doing. And so what I settled on kind of as my reference software platform for the visual vocabulary was PowerPoint. Because again, I'm dealing with those business people, the marketing people. What's the one piece of software I can be completely assured that every one of those people has? They might not even have Word, but you know that they have PowerPoint. So not just a collection of symbols, but it's a system. It has an internal logic. It allows you to interpret the relationship between these objects. It allows you to tell little stories in a visual way. So here's an example. We were talking about search engines just a few minutes ago. Here's an example of what you might have as a description of an interaction flow from, like a scenario, a user scenario, something like that. And I'm going to step through kind of how that would be expressed with the visual vocabulary. From the search query page, the user can submit a query. The system checks to see if the query is valid. If it is not valid, system returns the user to the query page. If the query is valid, the user is presented with a sequence of search results pages. From these pages, the user can navigate to one or more content pages matching the query, or they can return to the query page to refine the query. This is a very basic search flow. And here's a description of it. It's about 100 words long. Maybe the description doesn't leave a lot of room for interpretation, but everybody has a different writing style. But this diagram, because each of these elements has a precise definition, this diagram doesn't leave any room for interpretation in just a handful of shapes. And no, I'm not claiming to have invented the diamond for a decision point. I know that what I'm trying to do as much as possible with the design of this is leverage what people already know without requiring them to learn a whole lot of new stuff. One thing, so again, because I'm avoiding creating these great big documents that you have to own a plotter in order to be able to print them out, I needed to be able to create modular structures, because if I was doing anything of any level of complexity, the only choices that I had was either just shrink it all down so to make it really super tiny to fit it on a single 8.5 by 11 letter-sized piece of paper, or I need to be able to break the diagram up across multiple pages. So I have these modular elements here. This would allow us to direct people to other elements in other parts of the flow, to kind of untangle some of the complexity of all the intersections and interrelationships among all the different elements in an interaction flow, as well as to create these sort of reusable interaction objects. When you start doing this work, you start to see these same patterns repeat over and over again, where every time a user, like login is probably the classic example of, here's a basic interaction flow that I'm going to send somebody into, and then I'm going to bring them back out, but I'm going to bring them back out in a different place depending on what their context was when they went into it. And by creating this reusable object, I can kind of mix and match those objects as need be and communicate that context. Now this next part is, I think, the part where the real power of the visual vocabulary comes into play. Because these aren't just structure diagrams. They don't just show the relationships among the different elements. They also communicate logical relationships. So to be able to represent basic concepts in conditional logic, there are these elements in there that allow us to essentially parse out all of the different conditions that might influence the flow of the user through the application and show all the variations of the experience that the user might have based on those conditions and represent that in a fairly simple and straightforward way. Because these are really kind of fundamental building blocks, we take these building blocks and we can string them together, and we can put them together in ways to represent arbitrarily complex. You can have the most complex logical structures to how you're making decisions about what elements are being presented to users and how the users move through the flows, and the system can still express it. One of my favorite uses for the visual vocabulary is in experimenting with ideas and playing around with variations without having to build out interfaces, build out prototypes, draw up a bunch of sketches. I can just kind of imagine the user flows and make some choices here. So here's a really basic search flow where you've got a query, you submit the query, you get the search results. From there you can go back and refine the query. You can get on to the content pages. We can take that flow and embellish it a little bit to get the flow that I talked about earlier, where there's a step in between the query and the results where the system is doing a check on the validity of the query, so that the benefit of this is that you never get to a search results page unless you've composed a valid query. So we never get an empty results page. Your search has produced 0 results. That's not actually helpful to anybody. We can take this a step farther and say, well, since we're performing that system check anyway, what else can we do? Well, how about not just having a special case for if there are 0 results? What if we have a special case for if there's exactly 1 result? We can skip the search results pages altogether and just take them to that one content page. By doing this kind of sketching, experimenting with the flows in advance of actually sketching out interfaces, we can develop new ideas much more rapidly, and we can experiment with different approaches to the same interaction. And I think one of the most powerful uses for this as a tool in the designer's toolbox is for reverse engineering. Reverse engineering seems like a strange thing to think about in the context of design. You know, we think about, but if we define it in this way, then we can see an application for it. If we think of forward engineering, or just engineering, as applying the principles of sound design to create a finished product, then the idea of reverse engineering is to examine that finished product to uncover the principles underlying its construction. We can apply this as a method in this way: identifying components of the system, identifying interrelationships among those components, and creating an abstract representation of the entire system. Now, what I'm talking about is looking at other products analyzing the experiences that they deliver and figuring out what makes those experiences work, what makes those experiences effective. Taking them apart, identifying the components, identifying those interrelationships. When we create that abstract representation, we now have something that we can look at. We don't have to go back and use the product over and over again to re-experience it. We can look at this representation, we can understand how it works. We can apply that understanding in our own design work. Let's look at an example now. So there's a publication on the web called Boxes and Arrows. Boxes and Arrows is sort of an online magazine for information architects. And they asked me to kind of show off what the visual vocabulary could do a few years ago. And so for them, I created this. Now this is true. This is a poster-sized representation. This is a diagram of Yahoo Mail, and this is not system architecture. This is a diagram of the user experience. This articulates all of the things that you could do at that time with Yahoo Mail and how all the pieces fit together. And you can start to see some patterns in the design choices that they've made. So one thing, for example, I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. So here we have these, in the dotted lines, we've got the authenticated area. We've got all this other functionality that you don't have to be authenticated to access, but most of it is really kind of driving you either into authentication or over here into, at the time they had these premium services that they were trying to push. Back when Yahoo thought they could make money from their mail application. Then when you get down here into the authenticated area, the functionality really focuses on a couple of key pages. So over here on the right-hand side, you've got, on the right, you've got the address book functionality, and you can see there are only a couple of ways to get in there. But once you're in there, you're in this kind of self-contained little world of the address book. Over here on the left-hand side is the messaging functionality, and this really focuses around this, this one interface in particular, the message list. And anything, a lot of the core functionality kind of revolves around the user engaging with the message list. They might bounce away from it to do something else briefly, but they're going to come right back around to that message list sooner or later. You see all of the arrows pointing into it. So this is something that took me, I think it took me most of a Saturday afternoon to do. What I did was, again, so I didn't work on Yahoo Mail. I don't know anybody who did work on Yahoo Mail. This was simply from the point of view of the user, sitting down with it and poking at it and seeing how it reacted. But what I did was I did that poking in a systematic fashion, working through all of the options that the system provided me, testing the boundaries of that system. So I tried to see what happened if I sent an email to 1,000 people at once. But it doesn't let you do that. I tried a lot of different variations, trying to generate error conditions to see how the system would respond and documenting those responses. By doing that, I was able to create this documentation of the entire experience that the application delivers. And now I had this kind of frozen, this picture of it, how it works. I don't have to go back to the application and look at it in order to analyze the experience because I've got this picture of it. The other interesting thing about this is that about 3 months after I did this, Yahoo launched a new redesign of Yahoo Mail. And all of this stuff that I documented went away. No longer exists. This is a picture of a dead application. That doesn't mean it doesn't have value. There are a lot of dead applications out there, applications that don't exist anymore, that embody potentially valuable approaches to interaction design. But those approaches are lost to us if we don't have a means of documenting them. If we rely on Yahoo keeping that design in place for Yahoo Mail, in order for us to be able to learn from Yahoo Mail, there's some important value that we're losing there. So we can apply this as a method in a strategic way to inform our design work. If there's an application out there that you like how it works, you think that it might be valuable, if only because it's produced by one of your competitors, you can sit down and take the experience apart and use this vocabulary as a tool for documenting what you found. Not just observing by using it, but by going through it in methodical fashion and documenting what you see. Again, not trying to identify the underlying technologies or even how or what the functionality is of the website, but documenting system behavior, pushing the boundaries, following all the threads through, kind of exploring every corner of the application and documenting what you see. So some people, when I talk about this makes them a little bit nervous, because it kind of sounds like stealing, right? Somebody else put in a lot of work to design Yahoo Mail, and if I were to go out and launch a competitor simply by documenting the experience that I had with that website and creating a website that worked exactly like it, didn't I just steal their design? And isn't that something that might be subject to intellectual property law? Well, it's interesting because the answer to that question is maybe. I can't speak to international intellectual property law or intellectual property law in India, but here is how it works in the United States. In the United States, the best example that we have relating to copying interaction design comes from a time when software applications looked like this. This application that you see on the top here is Lotus 1-2-3, which once upon a time was the world's most popular spreadsheet application, running on many of those same machines that were running WordStar, which we saw this morning. This application down here on the bottom is a competing application. It was made by a company called Borland, and this application was called Quattro Pro. Back in 1990, Borland came out with a new version of Quattro Pro that had an interesting new feature that they called Lotus 1-2-3 Compatibility Mode. And what this was a preference that you would go into the application, you turn this preference on, and the entire application would reconfigure itself. The menus would move around, the menus would be renamed, all the key commands all changed, so that the entire thing functioned exactly, every interaction functioned exactly like Lotus 1-2-3. Lotus, as you might imagine, didn't take too kindly to this. They filed a lawsuit. They said that the structure of their menus was protected under United States copyright law, in the same way that the code was protected. So they went to court, and they fought this battle over whether or not this could be protected under copyright. And Lotus won the first round, and it went to a higher court, and then Borland won, and it went back and forth. And finally, It made its way to the highest court in the land, to the United States Supreme Court. And in the United States Supreme Court, there are 9 judges on the Supreme Court. One of the judges abstained from the ruling. They reached a 4-4 deadlock. They couldn't decide. Four of the judges thought that this was definitely a violation of copyright. 4 of the judges thought, no way, you can't protect interaction design under copyright law. So right now, we don't really know what possible legal protection there might be for interaction. Amazon is one example of an organization that has gone in a different direction. They look at the patent system as a way to protect interaction design. This one-click system actually is one of the interaction patterns that Amazon has patented. If you want to be able to buy something with one click, the reason that you don't see that same interaction everywhere on the web is because Amazon has patented the idea of storing your payment information as a preference so that you can, with a single click, make a purchase. When Apple wanted to institute this interaction pattern in the iTunes Music Store, when they decided to start selling music online, Apple decided that rather than fighting Amazon over it, they would simply license the patent from Amazon. So now, I think, I don't know exactly how it works, but more or less, every time you buy music from iTunes, Amazon makes a little bit of money. So why would I stand up here and encourage you to do something that's potentially illegal? Well, the way that I think about it is that all of us who are engaged in designing for this new medium are really part of this much larger project. There is so much undiscovered potential in this medium. But the way that we're going to reach that potential is by learning from each other. The dot-com era was full of a lot of crazy experimentation, a lot of different innovative ideas, and a lot of really bad business plans. But just because those organizations had bad ideas for businesses doesn't necessarily mean that they had bad ideas for user interaction. This is a site for a company called Webvan, which those of us who lived in San Francisco at the time were very big fans of Webvan. They would drive to your door and bring you groceries, which is great because San Francisco is a very difficult city to get around in. Webvan was not only innovative from that perspective, they also had a lot of really interesting ideas about interaction design. But again, that website's gone now. They went out of business. They couldn't sustain themselves as a business, and the interaction has vanished. We've lost it. And now, anybody who has never used Webvan, or anybody who can't really remember how it used to work, can't benefit from the work that those designers did, can't build on that work to create something better. And so this is why I think that we have a unique opportunity in using something like the visual vocabulary to document design work for ourselves and for each other, to start building a history and building a sense of collective wisdom about the work that we do. This is really what it's all about. Planning before you build. I hope that's okay. Having conscious reasons for the choices that you make, articulating those reasons explicitly, applying all of that craft, applying all of that knowledge, learning from each other so that we can all make things that people love. That emotional connection is the goal of our work, because that's what drives use and that's what drives adoption. We still have about 20 minutes to go, and I am out of material. So I'm going to thank you all very much, and I'm going to, at this point, offer myself up for any questions that you might have about anything that I've talked about. I've been talking for an hour and a half now. Thank you for sticking around. And hope you, if you're sticking around for the next couple of days of the summit, I hope you enjoy those as well.